Hey, thank you so much, Craig. I really appreciate you and Madeline and all you do to organize this group, and want to thank everybody for being here. An hour of your time on a Monday morning, I know is not easy to give up. I want you to know I take that really seriously, and my goal in the next 45 minutes or so that we spend together is to try to give you just as much value as I possibly can on some things that we're seeing really work well right now in the new media landscape. So let me see if I can get this going here. There we go.
And as you do that, people in chat is where you'll add your questions for Rusty that he'll take. We'll leave about 10 minutes at the end. So start adding your questions as he speaks. Thanks, Rusty.
Yeah. No, thank you for the reminder, Craig. You're exactly right. So I want to try to leave as much time as I can on the questions front. So here's where we're headed. I'm probably being a little bit ambitious in the 45 minutes or so that we have, but I want to try to cover a lot of ground. We're going to start off and really look at where we are right now in the new media landscape and why it is incredibly important for you to own your brand, and in particular to understand the image that you're creating for potential customers, for potential employers, etc. Then I want to talk through kind of a 7-step roadmap to build a successful personal brand. And then, as we mentioned, we'll leave some time for Q&A. All right, so let's get this out of the way. Usually when I give a presentation to a room full of leaders, whether it's in Austin or beyond, and I bring up this concept of a personal brand, this is either the face you're giving me from the audience or it's the face you want to give me from the audience. And the reason why is because for many of us, this concept of a personal brand or building a personal brand, in some cases feels a little bit wrong or a little bit potentially ego-driven. And certainly there are plenty of people who approach it the wrong way, where they're overly promotional or they're building kind of an ego-driven, hey, look at me kind of brand. And one of the things I want to be crystal clear about as we go through this morning is the purpose of getting intentional about your personal brand, and in particular, the purpose of getting intentional about the image you're creating in the minds of your audience is not to stroke your ego or to make you famous. In fact, it's completely the opposite. It's really look at how do we build mission-driven thought leadership? How do we create an environment where somebody that is looking at you as a potential employee, as a potential partner, as a potential place they want to do business, we've got to do something to accelerate those people to that decision versus causing some friction. So what I always like to do kind of around this idea of branding is let's just kind of start with the definition. So the way we define branding is creating an image in the minds of your audience. All right, so if you sort of think about that, creating an image in the minds of your audience. What's interesting is in today's media landscape, there are 2 very distinct phases to creating that image in the minds of your audience. So phase 1 is what we think of as pre-engagement. All right, so phase 1 is before you and I sit down for an interview. It's before I hire you, before I work with you in some capacity, before I get to know you, before I have a chance to see how smart you are and how purposeful you are. And so in phase 1, because the image that you create in my mind isn't created as a result of a great interview or great work or great results, it's created on page 1 of Google. And from there, if we're lucky, it's then created on your website or on your LinkedIn profile or on your Twitter account. And that initial image in phase 1 is either an image that is congruent with the quality that you're ultimately going to deliver to me once you join my company or once we start working together, or it's an image that's either non-existent because I can't find you, or number 2, if I can find you, is an image that doesn't do anything to accelerate me to the point that I say, hey, I'd love to interview you or I'd love to work with you in some capacity. And so we're going to spend a lot of time today on phase 1. Phase 2 is post-engagement. All right, so phase 2 is once you and I have a chance to work together, once I have a chance to understand how passionate and accomplished you are on your topic area, once I see what you can do. The image in phase 2 for most of you is exceedingly positive. You've got references, you've got people that know what great work you can do. What I want to talk about today is how do we take an exceedingly positive phase 2 image and move it upstream so that we can make sure before people have a chance to work with you, before they have a chance to interview you, that we're actually communicating an intentional image that is reinforcing you as a mission-driven thought leader in your topic area. So this is something that, those of you who've got a sheet of paper in front of you, maybe draw this out. This is what we look at as the brand flywheel. And I want you to imagine right in the middle of this circle, I want you to write your name. As I talked about, we've got really 2 phases on the branding front, and then we've got a word of mouth bridge coming across the top. So let's start with phase 1. Phase 1, again, this is before you and I meet in person, before I interview you, before I have a chance to work with you. And so when I enter phase 1, there are one of 2 places that I can enter phase 1. One way to enter phase 1 is there was no warm introduction, there was no referral, you just submitted an application. Or you sent me an email out of the blue and I don't have a point of reference for you. And one of the things that we've got to keep in mind is people coming into phase 1 off of the left side here, in other words, without a referral, without word of mouth, they're coming in with a lot lower lead velocity. In other words, they're coming in tiptoeing. You're in the big stack of resumes versus when, a friend of mine refers you to me as a great fit for the publicist I'm trying to hire or whatever it might be, you're coming in with a lot higher lead velocity in that case. So phase 1, what we're going to talk about here in a minute, but the way I want you to think about that, I want you to give yourself a grade. Right now, if I Google your name, are you positioned as one of many, as a commodity, or are you positioned as an authority or a mission-driven thought leader? I'm going to dig into that in more detail here in a second. Phase 2 is once, again, those people that have crossed over, that have had a chance to work with you, former bosses, former coworkers, former team members, people that know what you can do. In phase 2, the image that you create in the minds of your audience is connected back to the answer to one really simple question. And that is, did you over-deliver on somebody's expectations or did you under-deliver on somebody's expectations? Again, I'm going to assume that each of you are bringing great value in phase 2. And so I'm going to leave that to you. Part of what I want you to think about, most people, when they start looking for a job or when they start thinking about starting a business, the first place that they go is to start thinking about people that don't yet know you. In other words, people that you don't have a connection with yet. And one of the things that I want to really, really encourage for each of you today that we're going to talk a lot about is I want you to think really, really intentionally about who are the people right now that already know and love you. Who are the people that know what you can do? Who are the people that would love to go out there and help you? And how can we do a better job through content marketing and through creating this personal brand? How can we empower them to talk about you in a way that feels like they're winning versus in a way that feels like they're doing you a favor? Okay? So across the top is what we call the word of mouth bridge. And the word of mouth bridge is something that happens by happenstance for most people. In other words, that former boss that knows you're a rock star, they'd be happy to refer you, but right now the only way that they're referring you is if they're at the right meeting and somebody mentions at the table, hey, I'm looking for a new HR manager. Do you know anybody that's good? Well, yeah, actually, I've got a really good referral for you. Here's that person. So that kind of happenstance referral, for those of you that are looking for a job right now, we don't have the luxury in many cases of waiting for happenstance referrals or happenstance conversations. So what I want you to think about is how can we empower people to cross that word of mouth bridge? In other words, give them a reason to talk about you and a reason to talk about your content in a way that feels like they're winning. And again, I'm going to dig into that in a little bit more detail later. So I want you to give yourself a grade on each of these areas. My guess is for most of you, we've got A's and A pluses in phase 2. In phase 1, we're about to do a lot of work on how can we create something that actually accelerates people through to phase 2 where they're ready to raise their hand and say, hey, I'd love to have you come in for an interview, or you're on our short list. and then we'll talk a little bit about the word of mouth bridge as well. So I mentioned this earlier. First impressions are made online. The initial image that you create in my mind as a potential employer, as a potential partner, as a potential customer is created on page 1 of Google, okay? Your brand, whether we like it or not, your brand in phase 1 is what Google says it is, okay? And so, again, whether we like that or not, we've got to get intentional about owning that. So here's what I want you to imagine. This is something I'm going to ask each of you to do, an online brand audit around your name. And here's what I want you to imagine. Your last place of work, the last person that you worked for has just referred you by name to me as somebody that could fill the new position that I'm trying to hire. All right, fantastic. We've gotten that referral. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to kick the tires on my buddy's recommendation of you and make sure they're not the outlier in having a great experience working with you, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is pop your name into Google. For those of you who have not done this before or have not done it in a long time, one of the things that I want you to think about is if I go to Google and I type in your name, number 1, can you be found? In other words, when I Google your name, am I actually getting back to assets or real estate that are connected to you, okay? If I can't find you right now, there's typically one of 2 reasons. Number 1, you've just been a ghost online. You've never thought much about LinkedIn. You haven't really blogged. And if that's the case, cool. We're going to talk through how to change that today. For others of you, the other reason potentially that I can't find you is you have a brand name. In other words, you have a name that is so common that when I Google it, there's no way I can find you. All right, your name's John Smith, or your name is Susan Wilson, or something super common. And either it's so common that it's unrealistic that you could own search for it, or you are unlucky enough to have a really unique name that you share with a professional Major League Baseball player, or an axe murderer from the 70s, or somebody that's got a lot of results out there around your name. So one of the things that I want you to think about today, if you have a really common brand name, does it make sense to change your name? In other words, does it make sense to add a middle initial or a middle name to your brand name so that you can differentiate yourself? So one of my favorite authors is a guy named David Meerman Scott. He's written a bunch of great books on the changing world of PR and marketing. His name's David Scott. And he recognized early on that if he were out giving speeches and generating referrals and people Googled David Scott, the likelihood that people could actually find him was really low. So the way I want you to think about this, your brand name is like a piece of virtual real estate. Okay, so let's take David Scott. David Scott, if that were his brand name, the way I want you to envision that is he's standing on a piece of dirt with hundreds of other David Scotts, each of them trying to build the tallest tower in terms of visibility. He's fighting a losing battle. So when he adds that middle name, David Meerman Scott, what he does is he walks across the street to a piece of real estate that's completely empty, and with the very first brick, he owns search for his name. Okay? The guy that has single-handedly spent more money on advertising in the city of Austin than I've ever seen is a guy named Thomas Henry. All right, many of you don't know him as Thomas Henry because you recognized early on that that was a crowded piece of dirt. So he added in the J, Thomas J. Henry, and he owns search for that immediately. Again, love him or hate him, that's the focus there. So the first thing I want to ask you is if you don't yet own your name as a website address, so rustyshelton.com or bobhockaday.com or allisongersh.com, what I want you to do as soon as this meeting is over, I want you to go to godaddy.com and I want you to grab your name as a website address. Again, rustyshelton.com, okay? You don't have to build the website. You don't have to build the custom home yet. I want you to own the dirt around your name. While you're there, by the way, get your kids' names, get your grandkids' names. That real estate is valuable today. It's only going to get more valuable in the future. Okay, if you need to, for many of you, you're going to go to GoDaddy and your name's not available, and you're going to do this online brand audit, and I've got to go 5 pages deep to find you. If that's the case, foundationally, the starting point for this discussion, as unbelievable as it may seem to some of you, is we have got to add a middle initial or a middle name so that you can own search when I'm referred to you by name, so that I can actually find you. Again, I'm predisposed to want to find you because you've been referred to me. If I can't find you, we're just making this harder on ourselves than we should. Okay, so when you do this online brand audit, a couple things that I want you to think about. If you can be found, right now, ideally, for those of you that don't have a personal brand website, which is okay, ideally for me, the first result I want to see is your LinkedIn profile. Okay, right underneath that, maybe a Twitter account. We're going to go a little deeper on those 2 things, but I want you to think about on page 1 of those Google results, are the results there something that encourage me to move to phase 2? Maybe it's an award that you won, or I've got a media article, or I find a blog. Those are things that reinforce your authority. Versus if I get there and there's just not really much, and it's a LinkedIn profile that doesn't really look like it's been done professionally, et cetera, it's going to cause friction in me actually making it to phase 2. Responding to that audit, as I mentioned, do you need to change your name? One of the most important principles, assuming you've got a name that you can own, one of the most important principles of branding is the concept of authority by association. Okay, so one of the things you've got to keep in mind, again, I've been referred to you. When I get to your LinkedIn profile, if the images there are the little avatar picture of you, maybe suit and tie, nice little picture, and then if you've got in the header image, a picture of that sunset in Port A last year when you went there with your family, or the Colorado skyline, or whatever it might be, if it's just a generic picture up there, or if it is not a picture up there, you're missing a massive opportunity to create an image in my mind that builds authority by association. Okay, so the concept of authority by association, what you've got to understand is when people get to your website or your LinkedIn profile or your Twitter account, your picture doesn't bring an image yet to their mind, right? Because it's the first time they're seeing you. What does bring an image to their mind is if that header shot is a picture of you on stage and we've got a University of Texas logo behind you, or a TEDx logo behind you, or an Ernst & Young logo behind you, whatever it might be. In other words, a brand that actually does create an image in the minds of that audience. One of the reasons that I use, and you notice this in the first line of the introduction that Craig used for me, was the Harvard credential around the first speech that I did at that school earlier in my career. The main reason I use that is because most of you, again, my image doesn't, or my visual here probably doesn't bring an image to your mind because I'm not super well known here in Austin. So what we want to be able to do for most people is we want to be able to associate you with brands that potential employers, potential teammates, potential partners do know and respect. Okay, and so for those of you who are sitting there thinking, yeah, Rusty, I'd love, gosh, I wish I had done a TEDx speech, or I wish I'd, had that picture at UT. I haven't spoken before. I don't have that yet. What I want you to think about for that header image is go back through and do a bit of an audit of visuals over the last 10 years of your career. And I want you to think about the setting that you were in that connotes the most authority for you. Okay, and by the way, worst case scenario, get a picture of you with headphones on doing a podcast interview. That what happens when I get to your LinkedIn profile, if I see that, or I see a picture of you speaking versus the Port A sunset, an image is created in my mind of, okay, wow, she's had no idea she spoke at St. Ed's, or in other words, it is reinforcing your thought leadership. Okay, those of you who have experience working with Fortune 500 companies, or you've done media in the past, what I want you to think about for your bio on LinkedIn, and what I want you to think about around your resume, the thing that moves the needle the most for people in phase 1 is your association with brands and individuals and institutions that they do have an image in their mind for, whether that is UT or TEDx or Amazon, etc. So I want you to, if you have that stuff right now buried deep in a 1,000-word bio that I've got to dig for, bring it up to the top, visually reinforce it when you submit that resume or when you have it on LinkedIn. This last bullet point, setting security parameters, part of what I want you to think a little bit about and be honest on this. On your Facebook page, on your Twitter account, is the information that I find there, again, going to reinforce you as a mission-driven thought leader, or is the information that I find there going to make me worry about you being a liability in terms of super political stuff or certain things that you posted? That's not a light bulb moment for any of you, but I wanted to bring that up as a reminder, because in phase one, the smallest thing is going to prevent somebody from deciding to raise their hand and move to phase two. So let's remove any and all of those barriers. Step 4, we need to decide what your home base is going to be online. Okay? Are you going to start with a website? And by the way, for most of you, putting a website together is really not that difficult, and it's really not that expensive. So if I'm a potential employer and I Google your name and I get to, BettyLSmith.com or whatever it might be, and when I get to that page, I've got a professional bio. I see a visual of you in a setting that connotes authority. I've got all of your information there. That's going to differentiate you from all of the other people that I'm looking at that have the same old resume. They're coming in the same front door as everybody else. So if you have that, awesome. If not, if you're not ready to do the website, cool. Let's think about the next best hub for your brand. And for most of you, that's going to be LinkedIn. For some of you, maybe Twitter. For some of you, Instagram, depending on which area you're looking to get hired in. But for most of you, I want you to default to LinkedIn as the potential best home base for you online. I want to spend a few minutes talking about where we are right now in the new media landscape, and then I want to give you some really specific strategies as we look to ramp up your content going forward. So one of the big shifts that has happened in the media landscape over the past 10 years in particular is we, as the media consuming public, are increasingly moving our attention away from large generic media and redeploying that attention to what we like to call micro media. Individual thought leaders, individual experts that we perceive to be not only more trustworthy, but also more interesting, more authentic, and more informative. So part of what I want to try to empower each of you is your audience, your target audience increasingly would rather learn directly from you via a great podcast or a great blog or a great newsletter than they would give it their attention to large generic media. And so this idea of individual thought leaders building an audience, what I want to try to really empower each of you around, your audience is looking to learn from you right now if you can get intentional about doing that. So my wife always gives me a hard time about this graphic. She says, all right, Rusty, if this is the new media landscape, why does it look like it was designed in 1940? So I get it. What I like about this is the simplicity of this. So in today's media landscape, we have 3 categories of media. We have rented media, we have earned media, and we have owned media. When I started my career, came out of University of Texas back in 2003, and my very first job coming out of school was actually as a book publicist in Austin, Texas. And I'll never forget walking in the door my first day on the job. I had 8 books stacked on my desk, I had a telephone, and I had a 3-ring binder. This is 17 years ago. It feels like the stone ages of PR and marketing. But my job, if I was pitching drive time radio in Atlanta, I'd thumb through that 3-ring binder, I'd get to the Atlanta page, I'd pick up the phone, cold call a producer and try to charm them into having one of my authors on their drive time radio show. And so if you think back to that previous media environment, if you wanted to get a message out at scale, there were only 2 ways to do it. You could either rent the media's platform by buying an ad, the newspaper or on radio, or you could earn your way onto their platform by getting featured or interviewed. But in that previous media environment, there was no way for you to kind of push the media out of the way and go directly to your audience at scale. You could do it one customer by one customer, but not at scale. Fast forward to where we are today, we still have rented media, we still have earned media, but the biggest game changer, and I'm gonna really try to encourage each of you, the biggest opportunity for leverage and impact for you around your message is the growth of owned media. All right, so let's just briefly unpack these three. Rented media, the definition there, these are all of the messages that go out where you fully control the content, but somebody else owns the real estate. Somebody else owns the audience, okay? Advertising is the obvious in this category. The other big thing though that lives in this category are your social media channels. So your LinkedIn profile, your Facebook page, your Twitter account, Instagram, all live up there in that rented media category. And the reason why is because even though you're not technically paying for every post on LinkedIn, the way I want you to think about your LinkedIn profile or your Facebook page is it's kind of like you're gathering an audience on dirt that LinkedIn owns or dirt that Facebook owns. And your ability to get to that audience is completely beholden to LinkedIn's algorithm or Facebook's algorithm, okay? And it's not that I don't want you to be active on LinkedIn and Twitter. In fact, I do, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I want you to be crystal clear that when you build an audience on social media, that is not an audience that you own. That is an audience that you are renting at the behest of whatever the latest algorithm changes for LinkedIn. So one of the big things I want to encourage for each of you, anytime you have a message going out, either on rented or on earned media, what we're really trying to do is two things. Number one, we're trying to over-deliver with the message itself. Of course, we're trying to write a great article for LinkedIn or give a great interview or give a great speech. Of course. The second thing we're trying to do is how do we give this person who is getting this information on real estate that LinkedIn owns, or real estate that KUT owns, or real estate whoever owns, how do we give them a reason to get up out of their seat and follow you back over to real estate that you own? And I'll talk just a little bit more about that here in a second. Earned media is the second category. So earned media, these are all of the messages that go out on real estate somebody else owns, where the impression of the audience is that you have earned that message. Okay, so these are awards that you've won. These are recommendations, referrals, positive word of mouth, warm introductions, PR interviews, speaking gigs. Nothing does more for your authority or your thought leadership than earned media, right? A message just hits us differently in this category. So I want to make sure for each of you, as we're thinking about building this more intentional image in phase one, I want you to do an audit of how much earned media you have right now. And one of the biggest things that I want us to do going forward is try to generate more of that to reinforce and elevate the perceived authority that you're bringing to the table for a business. The last category, just briefly before I jump to content strategy, owned media includes all of the assets where you fully own the connection to your audience. This is your website, this is your blog, this is your email list. Okay, these are people you can reach anytime you want to. Those of you who don't have an email newsletter, who aren't doing one of those right now, my strong encouragement to you is to start creating an email newsletter that is actually worth reading. Okay, most of us, I probably get 100 email newsletters a month. Most of them I can't delete quickly enough when they come into my inbox because I'm perceiving that I'm about to be sold or marketed to. There are a couple that I look forward to reading every single month because I know when I open it up, I'm going to laugh, I'm going to learn something, I'm going to get value from those people. And what I want to encourage for each of you, for your audience, for the people that already know and love you, there is no easier way that exists for them to refer you than the ability to click forward on a good email newsletter and say, here's the woman I was telling you about last week. I totally forgot to make that intro. I want to recommend that you reach out to her for that position you're hiring. Okay, so think about that email newsletter in a little bit of a different way. Because we're running a little short on time, I want to jump right to content strategy. So part of what I want you to think about, I want to go back to the two phases of branding here. This idea of getting a little bit more active with your content, the way I want you to think about this is I want to take the value, the perspective, the insight, the expertise that for most of you is trapped in phase 2. In other words, I can only get it once I hire you, or I can only get it once I start working with you. And I want us to try to move that upstream and put it out at more scale. Okay, so winning today is thinking more like the media. Okay, the way I want you to think about your content strategy, when I say content strategy, for most people, the first questions around content marketing or building a brand is the where. In other words, hey, Rusty, should I start a podcast? Should I be on LinkedIn? Should I start a blog? And in fact, the where of content is much less important than the what. What kind of content is your audience actually looking for? The distribution part's the easy part. The way I want you to think about your content strategy is kind of like it's your personal newspaper, okay? And the mistake that I see most well-meaning would-be thought leaders make with their personal newspaper is either they fill it with ads, meaning it's just overly promotional, overly ego-driven, or the much more common mistake that I see is they fill their newspaper with op-eds or opinion pieces, meaning it's only the Rusty Shelton show again and again and again and again. And there's two problems with that. Number one, I'm going to get bored with that pretty quick. Number two, if I'm starting with a pretty small audience and all I'm serving up is my own stuff, it's a super slow grind in terms of growth. So what I want to recommend for each of you are 3 global categories of content. Category number 1 is what we call you-driven content. So you-driven content is content that connects back to your perspective, your expertise, your intellectual property, your stories, your lessons learned. And you-driven content for most people is what they're doing at 99% of their content strategy. I want you to limit it to 1/3 of what you're putting out. And by the way, this is content that's going out on LinkedIn. This might be content that's going out on your blog. This might be content that's going out on a podcast. 1/3 is you-driven. Category number 2 is news-driven content. Going back to David Meerman Scott, he coined a term called newsjacking, which is taking something that's very prominently in the news right now and connecting it back to your message. One of the best ways that you can attract the attention of potential employers, of potential partners, of potential customers is to connect your message to the things that they are worried about, anxious about, excited about, paying attention to in the news. And for this category, the way I want you to really think about this is you almost want to think like a Wall Street Journal op-ed writer or a New York Times op-ed writer. In other words, you're providing your analysis on those issues that are of high importance. Be careful around super polarizing issues. And in fact, for most of you, I want you to stay away from those if possible. And I want you to focus in on big issues in your topic area that you can provide expertise on. The last category is the one that I actually think for most of you is going to be the single most impactful thing, I hope, from this presentation, and that is relationship-driven content. My favorite way to use content marketing is as an excuse to reach out to somebody that I want to build a relationship with, or as an excuse to put a spotlight on somebody that I believe has a message or story that needs to be heard. When I go talk to college students that are coming out of school that are trying to figure out, okay, how do I get a job? What I tell them is every single person that is trying to get a job is submitting their resume. Every single person is coming in asking for something. What I recommend for college students is something I'm going to recommend for each of you as well. And that is, if you want to get a job in PR and you're coming out of the University of Texas, the best way to get a job in PR is not to push resumes at people, right? You're one of many. You're a commodity when you do that. What I encourage students to do is in your junior year or in your senior year, what I want you to do is I want you to identify who all of the founders and leaders are of PR firms in the area where you want to get a job. So let's say you're trying to get hired in Austin. You might go to the Austin Business Journal top 25 list in PR. And what I want you to do when you reach out to those executives is not to ask for something. Okay, it's not, hey, here's my resume, which I'm forwarding to my hiring manager, and you're in a stack with everybody else. What I encourage them to do is I want you to go to that CEO and I want you to tell them, hey, I'm doing an interview series on the changing world of PR in Austin. I'd love to interview you on my LinkedIn page or on my blog or on my podcast and learn a little bit more about your perspective on that. Well, number one, the worst thing that can happen is you hear back from that person, you do the interview, you build goodwill with them, you give them a reason to share that interview with other people. What I have found, if you go out and do that, is over the course of 6 months or a year, number one, instead of it being a applicant to hirer interaction, in other words, a salesperson to prospect interaction, when you interview somebody, it's a peer-to-peer interaction about a topic of shared interest. And this goes back again on the empowerment side. I want you to think more like the media than a marketer with the way you're creating your content. The more other people that you can involve in your content strategy, the better off we're gonna be. For that interview series, I want you to mix it up, ideally. So I want you to do a certain amount of people that are people that you don't know. But what I also want you to think about are who are the people right now that already know and love you, that would love to refer you to other people. And right now they're just doing it only when they get asked. When you interview those people, so if you go to somebody and say, hey, I want to interview you about your perspective on the changing world of PR on my LinkedIn profile. When that interview runs and they share it on LinkedIn or share it on Facebook, they're going to wax on about their experience with you. In other words, my good friend, Craig Foster, one of the top experts on over-delivering on value for job-seeking networks, was kind enough to interview me. In other words, I'm going to package that share as praise for you. And what you've done when you do that is you've empowered that person to go talk about and point their audience over to your LinkedIn profile in a way that they also win. In other words, it's a win-win situation in that case. Really, really think hard about how you can integrate relationship-driven content in what you're doing. Next level content, so diversifying, I think, is also important. The more video you do, the more podcasts you do, the better. The last thing I want to wrap up with before we open it up for questions, and I hope we'll get plenty of time to do that. Those of you who are not on Twitter yet, I want to really strongly encourage you to reconsider Twitter. So most people think of Twitter as the most obnoxious, most self-promoting, most ridiculous social media platform out there. And to be sure, there's plenty of that going on. The way I want you to think about Twitter is the world's biggest cocktail party. Okay? And if you walk in the door at a massive cocktail party, what do you hear? You just hear overwhelming noise, right? And what people are doing on Twitter is the same thing they're doing at the cocktail party. They're circled up talking about a million different topics. That group over there is talking about Texas Longhorn football. That group over there is talking politics. They're loud, obnoxious, stay away from them. That group over there is talking about your industry. So what we want to do on Twitter, the magic on Twitter is not wandering aimlessly through this cocktail party. The magic on Twitter is the same thing that is the magic at a good networking event or a good cocktail party, and that is finding the right circles of people that connect back to things that you're interested in or things you can add value to. On Twitter, the other big thing that most people don't recognize is a lot of companies put their job postings on Twitter around hashtags like #AustinJobs. And so those of you who are looking around on the job front, Twitter in a lot of cases can be a really good place to identify that. I don't have time to train on Twitter today, but on my website, rustyshelton.com, you can get a free download. That's the Twitter Playbook. That's a 40-page ebook on how to use Twitter. LinkedIn, for most of you, if you don't have a website yet, if you haven't been real active, typically LinkedIn is the quickest way for you to own search around your name. There's 3 things that I want to mention just in close here, Craig, before I throw it back over to you to facilitate some Q&A. On LinkedIn, the way I want you to think about LinkedIn used to be essentially a place that we would only look when we were either trying to get hired or trying to hire somebody. It used to be a very transactional platform. LinkedIn, especially post-acquisition by Microsoft, has done a fantastic job of reinventing the value prop from LinkedIn. And now for most people, LinkedIn is their home base as a professional. Okay. So what I want you to do on LinkedIn is I want you to go back to your profile and I want you to take a hard look at a couple of different things. Number one, in that header image, again, I mentioned it earlier, I want the visual of you in the setting that connotes the most authority, the most thought leadership, the most authenticity that we can possibly get. Okay? If you spoke at an event 3 years ago and you never got any pictures, what I'm asking you to do is find the email address of that meeting planner or that organizer and send them an email and say, hey, do you guys, could you send me a couple pictures from that event? Or did you get any pictures at that event? That one image of you speaking at UT or you on stage at South by Southwest or whatever it might be, that one image might be the difference between somebody raising their hand to interview you or not. Okay, so take a look at that header image. In the little avatar, it's just your headshot. Whatever's the most appropriate headshot there is great. In your one-line bio on LinkedIn, what I want to encourage for each of you, give the facts, but also, if you can, share what you're passionate about. Passionate about more efficient supply chains, or hopefully it's something maybe a little more exciting than that. But whatever the thing is that your mission is about related to your career, that's what I want to see there. LinkedIn, again, it used to be like a virtual resume. They now give you the ability to do a full narrative bio. Okay, so that narrative bio, I want to see 600 words of the most action-packed, authority by association, mission-driven content that I can possibly see for you. Again, I am making a judgment oftentimes when I get to that LinkedIn profile. Is this somebody that is worth the time to interview or hire or work with in some capacity? Let's make sure that we do the best job possible, not only to own that image, but to be intentional about it. The last thing that I want to mention on LinkedIn also gives you the ability now to create a blog there. So those of you who want to do this interview series and you don't have a website and you're not really interested in doing a podcast yet, you can do it on LinkedIn with what's called long form content. When you log on to LinkedIn, that main news feed, there's an option there to share something. There's an option to post a video or a photo, and there's an option to write an article. When you click write an article, it gives you the ability to write something that's a little bit more long form there. And I think for many of you can really help kind of getting to that next level. So Craig, I know covered a lot of ground right there, but I want to make sure to leave a little bit of time as I'm sure people have some questions about this, and I can take plenty of them right now, and I can also take some via email if that's helpful as well. So I'll stop the share around that.
And what's your email address, Rusty?
Yeah, email address is Rusty, RUSTY, at zilkermedia.com. Zilker like Zilker Park, zilkermedia.com.
Great. So one question was, if I add my middle initials, people still be able to find me. So if they search for Craig Foster and I put Craig F. Foster, will they still be able to find me?
So I think two things there, Craig. Number one is, for most of you, if you need the middle initial, they're not finding you right now. In other words, it's not like we're losing something, because if you need to add that, it's because they got to pack a lunch to go 7 pages deep on the Google results. So what I would like to recommend there, Craig, is if you add the D, if it's Craig D. Foster, that's your name from here forward. That's on your LinkedIn profile. That's on your resume. That's on your business card. That's your Twitter account. That's how you introduce yourself in those settings. And that middle initial, as weird as it's going to feel right out of the gate for most of you, is going to become like second nature in 6 months or in a year because of the importance of it.
Okay, how about instead adding a designation like John Smith MBA or John Smith PMP? What do you think about doing it that way?
You know, what I've typically found on that, Craig, is the only place that works is around, if I've got Dr. first name, last name.com or first name, last name MD, I think that works well. When I've seen people that have added the MBA there, most people are not going to add an MBA around a search term, even if that's what's communicated on a resume. I'm just going to type in Craig Foster, not Craig Foster MBA. So I think it's harder to get somebody to go along for the ride with professional credentials than it is with the middle initial.
Okay, question, how often should I change my LinkedIn profile or my summary on LinkedIn?
So in my opinion, get to the best bio that you can, and then I'd like that to be pretty static. Maybe every quarter you take a look at it to say, is there something I can add in here that's meaningfully different? Where I want people, Craig, to do much more content is on the short form section and the long form section on LinkedIn, where they're writing articles or posting interviews across you-driven, news-driven, relationship-driven content. That's the biggest thing, and I want people to be updating frequently. It is that kind of stuff. Because when you do that, the worst thing that happens is you give value to your network. The best thing that happens is we reinforce your expertise on your topic area.
Okay. And I think I know the answer to this, but one question was, I'm a job seeker. I got 41 million people looking for a job. How do I stand out? And I think you're all about thought leadership, and to start a presence on LinkedIn or a website, to start being a presence for being a thought leader in your field. What else would you add to that or add on to that?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, Craig, is what we've got to be able to do when we've got 41 million people right now is we've got a massive sea of, for lack of a better term, commoditization. What we've got to do for each of you is we've got to pull you out and find ways to differentiate you from the 50 other people that applied for that job. And oftentimes the best way to differentiate you from those people is not with, a resume that's got the right font on it, or in other words, it is got to happen in phase one of brand building. When somebody Googles that name, that they get to a LinkedIn profile. My gosh, she's got 3,200 followers on LinkedIn. I have no idea she'd spoken at St. Edward's. That kind of stuff is what differentiates you. The other thing I would mention, Craig, again, alongside a normal search, I'm not saying stop sending resumes out, but if you can layer in alongside that, that interview series that I talked about where you're involving other people, that is one of the best ways to control outbound relationships.